I never should have agreed to handle that recovery, but the city needed someone with experience, and I thought I understood what we were dealing with. My name is Michael Rains, and I have worked as a funeral director at Westbrook Memorial Services in Portland, Oregon for 17 years. In that time, I've handled everything from routine burials to mass casualty events, and I've learned that the dead rarely surprise you if you treat them with respect and follow procedure. The Metro construction site on Burnside Street taught me I was wrong. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late September. City engineers had broken through to a sub basement level while excavating for the new subway line and discovered what appeared to be an unmarked mass grave. The site dated back to the 1880s, likely connected to the old Riverview Asylum that burned down in 1892. Records showed 207 patients died in that fire, but the burial site had been lost to history, paved over decades ago when the neighborhood was redeveloped. The city contracted my firm to oversee the recovery and cataloging process. Standard procedure for historical remains. I arrived at the site that afternoon with my assistant director, Carolyn Voss, and our intake coordinator, David Park. The construction company had erected a temporary processing tent over the excavation area, and a forensic archaeology team from the university was already on site, carefully documenting each set of remains as they were recovered. The work was slow, methodical, and deeply respectful. Each body was photographed in situ, then transferred to a numbered body bag for transport to the medical examiner's office. By the end of the first week, we had recovered 199 complete sets of remains. The archaeologists were confident we were nearly finished. That's when the counting started to feel wrong. I noticed it first in the intake logs. David had documented 199 transfers, but when I cross-referenced with the archaeological site map, there were 200 excavation locations marked as containing remains. I assumed we'd miscounted or that one location had been empty, a false reading on the ground-penetrating radar. I mentioned it to Carolyn, who suggested we recount the body bags in the temporary cold storage unit the city had set up on site. We counted 3 times that evening, 199 bags. The numbers matched our logs perfectly. The site map was wrong. I marked it as resolved in my notes and went home. The next morning, the security company called me at 6:45. Their overnight guard had reviewed the camera footage from the storage tent and found something he wanted me to see. I drove back to the site, coffee still hot in my hand, expecting maybe a raccoon had gotten into the tent or some equipment had shifted. The guard, a quiet man named Torres, queued up the footage on his laptop. The timestamp read 3:07 in the morning. The interior camera showed the rows of body bags, all sealed and numbered, lying on the metal gurneys exactly as we'd left them. Then, at the far end of the tent, near bag number 143, a figure walked into frame. It wasn't one of our crew. The person was tall, wearing what looked like a dark coat or robe, moving slowly between the bags. The footage quality was poor, grainy, and overexposed in spots, but I could see them pause at certain bags, leaning down as if reading the numbers. They touched nothing, disturbed nothing. After roughly 2 minutes, they walked out of frame toward the tent entrance. Torres had checked the entrance logs. No one had entered or exited the tent between midnight and 6 in the morning. The tent had a single entry point, and it was locked from the inside with a padlock that showed no signs of tampering. I asked him to show me the exterior camera footage. There was none. The exterior camera had malfunctioned at 3:02 in the morning and resumed recording at 3:12. Exactly the window when the figure appeared inside. I thanked Torres and told him I'd handle it, as I didn't know what else to say. We resumed the recovery work that afternoon. The archaeology team found the 200th set of remains in the northeast corner of the excavation site, exactly where their map indicated. David logged it, bagged it, and transferred it to the tent. I stood there watching, trying to reconcile the math. We'd counted 199 yesterday. We'd found one more today. That made 200 total, but the asylum records said 207 died in the fire. I recounted the body bags myself before leaving that night. 200 exactly. I locked the tent personally, checked the padlock twice, and made Torres promise to call me if anything else appeared on the cameras. He called at 3:14 in the morning. I didn't answer. I already knew what he was going to say. The next day, I told the city we'd recovered all the remains the site could yield. The archaeology team agreed the excavation was complete. We transferred all 200 bags to the medical examiner's office for final processing and reburial in the new memorial section at Riverside Cemetery. The ME's office called me 2 weeks later with their final count. 201 sets of remains had been cataloged and prepared for reburial. I asked them to recount. They did. 201. I never told them about the security footage. I never told Caroline or David. I archived the case file and moved on to other work, but I think about it every time I drive past that subway entrance on Burnside Street. Last month, the memorial section at Riverside Cemetery opened to the public. All 201 individuals from the Riverview Asylum fire were laid to rest with dignity in numbered plots. The city held a small ceremony. I attended. When I walked through the section afterward, I noticed plot 201 was slightly sunken, as if the soil beneath had settled unevenly. The groundskeeper said it happens sometimes with old remains, nothing to worry about. But the nameplate on that plot is blank. Every other grave has a number and the words Riverview Asylum 1892. Plot 201 has nothing. I asked the cemetery director about it. She checked her records and frowned. According to her files, Plot 201 doesn't exist. The memorial section only goes to 200. I stood there staring at that blank marker for a long time before I left. I still drive past the subway entrance sometimes. I've never taken that line. Every funeral home has a story about a body that wouldn't stay still, but I thought I'd heard them all until I worked the 1918 recovery site. My name is Jude Ellison, and I have worked as an embalmer at Fairmont Funeral Services in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania for 12 years. My specialty is historical remains restoration, particularly cases where tissue preservation has failed and skeletal reconstruction is required. When the city began subway expansion beneath Market Street and unearthed a mass grave from the Spanish flu pandemic, they contracted our firm to handle the remains. The manifest listed 83 victims, all buried in a single emergency pit in October of 1918 when the morgues were overflowing and the city ran out of coffins. I expected difficult work. Remains that old, buried in acidic soil, rarely come up clean. But the numbers should have been simple. 83 bodies went in. 83 sets of remains should come out. The excavation began on a Monday in early November. The forensic team worked in careful grid sections, documenting each burial position before we transferred the remains to our facility for cataloging and preparation. By Wednesday afternoon, they'd recovered all 83 sets of remains. I signed off on the intake forms. The math was clean. Thursday morning, my assistant, Rebecca Hall, started the inventory process in our preparation room. She laid out each set of remains on numbered exam tables, photographing and measuring before beginning restoration work. Standard protocol. At 11:30, she came to my office looking pale. "We have it 84, she said. I told her to recount. Excavation sites are chaotic, easy to miscount in the field. She went back. 20 minutes later, she returned with the same answer. 84 complete sets of skeletal remains were laid out in the prep room. I followed her back and counted them myself. She was right. 84 tables, each with a complete skeleton, all tagged with excavation grid numbers. I checked the intake logs. 83 transfers from the site. I checked the excavation map. 83 marked burial locations. But 84 bodies were in my prep room. I called the site supervisor, a man named Colin Drake. He was adamant. His team had cleared all 83 marked locations and found nothing else. The excavation was complete. He suggested maybe we'd miscounted during transfer, that 2 remains got bagged together and we'd separated them at our facility. I examined every skeleton carefully. All 84 were complete. No split sets, no doubled remains. 84 distinct individuals. Rebecca and I spent that afternoon remeasuring and redocumenting everything. We assigned new identification numbers, took fresh photographs, updated all our files. By 6 in the evening, we had a clean, verified inventory. 84 sets of remains. I locked the prep room and went home, telling myself we'd find the error in the paperwork eventually. Friday morning, the forensic anthropologist arrived for her assessment. Dr. Sarah Chin was contracted by the city to provide age, sex, and trauma analysis for the historical record. She worked methodically through each skeleton, dictating notes while Rebecca recorded. I was in my office when she knocked on my door at 2 in the afternoon. "Your count is wrong," she said. I felt my chest tighten. "We verified 84 yesterday. I've examined 85. We went to the prep room together. I counted aloud, touching each table. 85 occupied exam tables. The new one was positioned at the end of the second row, between tables 42 and 43. The skeleton was complete, carefully arranged, tagged with a grid number I didn't recognize from the excavation map. Doctor. Chen was already examining it. Adult male, mid-30s, no obvious trauma, same burial depth and soil composition as the others. She looked at me. When did this arrive? I had no answer. Rebecca checked the security footage from the prep room. No one had entered after we locked up Thursday night. No deliveries, no transfers. The room had been sealed, yet 85 bodies were present. Dr. Chen wanted to continue her work. I told her to finish her assessments, and we'd sort out the counting error afterward. She spent the rest of Friday and all of Saturday documenting each skeleton. Sunday morning, she emailed me her final report. 86 individuals cataloged and assessed. I didn't go back to the facility. I called Rebecca and asked her to verify the count without telling her what Dr. Chen had reported. She called me back 30 minutes later. 86, Jude. I counted 3 times. Monday morning, I contacted the city and requested they send a second forensic team to recount and re-verify everything. They sent Dr. James Porter, a colleague of Dr. Chen's. He arrived Tuesday and spent 2 full days conducting his own independent inventory. His final count, 87. I watched him work through the security cameras in my office. I saw him move methodically from table to table, documenting, measuring, photographing. I watched him pause at table 61, then check his notes, then count the entire room again. When he came to my office afterward, he looked shaken. I need you to explain something, he said. This skeleton, number 61, it wasn't here when I started this morning. I pulled up the morning footage. Table 61 was empty at 8 in the morning when Dr. Porter entered the prep room. By noon, it held a complete skeleton, fully articulated, positioned identically to all the others. No one had entered the room. The door had remained locked. Dr. Porter had been the only person inside. The skeleton had simply appeared. We sealed the prep room that afternoon. I contacted the city and told them we couldn't continue the restoration work. I didn't explain why. I told them there were site contamination concerns and liability issues. They were unhappy, but they agreed to transfer the remains to a different facility. The new facility, Morrison Memorial in Camden, took possession of all 87 sets of remains on Thursday. I signed the transfer paperwork personally. I watched every body bag loaded into the transport truck. I counted them twice. Morrison called me Friday morning. Their intake coordinator wanted to verify the count. They'd received 88 bags. I told them to contact the city directly. I closed the case file. I haven't worked a historical recovery since. Last week, I received a letter from the City Records Department. The new memorial dedicated to the 1918 flu victims was complete, and they wanted to confirm the final burial count for the dedication plaque. How many individuals were recovered from the Market Street excavation? The manifest said at 83. The excavation team recovered 83, but I have no idea how many are buried in that memorial now. I wrote back and told them to use the original manifest number. 83 seemed safer than trying to explain the truth. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if they're still counting. If the number keeps growing, one skeleton at a time, appearing in whatever facility holds them. I wonder what happens when you bury something that refuses to stay buried. I don't work historical recoveries anymore, but I still think about Table 61, about how it was empty one moment and occupied the next, with no one else in the room. The dead aren't supposed to arrive on their own. If you ever hear knocking from inside a casket that's already been sealed and buried, don't investigate. I learned that lesson at Pinewood Cemetery, and I've never forgotten it. My name is Sal Moretti, and I have worked as head groundskeeper at Pinewood Cemetery in Lancaster, Pennsylvania for 23 years. I've dug graves, maintained headstones, and kept the grounds peaceful for thousands of families. I thought I understood every sound a cemetery makes, the way soil settles, the way wind moves through the trees, the way old markers shift in winter. I was wrong about what else makes noise here. The expansion project began in late April of 2022. We needed additional burial space in the northeast section, which meant clearing an overgrown area that had been abandoned since the 1940s. The land was rough, full of sunken spots and old foundation stones from a building that burned down decades ago. I supervised the clearing crew, making sure we didn't disturb any unmarked graves. We used ground-penetrating radar to check before we started digging. That's when we found them. 12 small burial sites arranged in two perfect rows of 6, all showing casket-sized anomalies about 4 feet down. No markers, no records, nothing in the cemetery archives about burials in that location. We contacted the Historical Society and discovered the land had been part of the old Greenbrier home for children, an orphanage that burned in 1943. 12 children died in that fire. Their burial location had been lost when the records were destroyed. The state required a proper excavation and reburial before we could continue the expansion. We contracted an archaeological firm and a funeral director named Patricia Wells to oversee the recovery. The work began on a Monday in early May, and by Wednesday afternoon, we'd located and recovered all 12 caskets. That's when I noticed they were facing the wrong direction. Traditional Christian burial practices orient the deceased east to west, with the head toward the west, so they face the rising sun on Resurrection Day. It's not just custom, it's documented protocol in every cemetery I've worked. But these 12 caskets were positioned north to south, perpendicular to every other grave in Pinewood's 160-year history. I mentioned it to Patricia. She said sometimes emergency burials or orphanage burials didn't follow standard orientation, especially during wartime when resources were scarce. She suggested we reorient them properly during reburial as a sign of respect. I agreed. We transported all 12 caskets to a temporary processing tent we'd set up near the maintenance building, where they'd be assessed and prepared for reburial in the children's memorial section. The caskets were old, simple wood, most of them partially collapsed or damaged from decades underground. Patricia and her team carefully documented each one, then placed them in protective storage boxes for the reburial ceremony scheduled for the following Monday. We positioned them in the tent in 2 rows of 6, this time oriented properly east to west. That Thursday night, my assistant groundskeeper, a young man named Marcus Reed, called me at home. He was finishing some late trimming work near the maintenance building and said he could hear something from inside the processing tent. A rhythmic sound, like someone tapping on wood. I told him it was probably the caskets settling, that old wood makes noise as it adjusts to temperature changes. He said it didn't sound like settling, it sounded deliberate. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more knocks. Over and over, I drove back to the cemetery. It was nearly 10 in the evening, full dark, and the processing tent was lit by a single work light we'd left on inside. Marcus was standing about 20 feet from the entrance, holding his trimming shears, looking pale. "It stopped when you pulled up," he said. We stood there in the quiet for several minutes. I heard nothing but wind in the trees and distant traffic on Route 30. I told Marcus to go home, that I'd check the tent and lock it up properly. After he left, I walked to the tent entrance and listened. Silence. I opened the flap and stepped inside. The 12 storage boxes were arranged exactly as we'd left them, 2 rows of 6, oriented east to west. I checked each one, looking for shifting or damage. Everything was secure. I was about to leave when I noticed something wrong. The caskets were facing north to south again. Not the storage boxes, those hadn't moved. But inside each protective box, the old wooden caskets had somehow rotated 90 degrees, returning to their original burial orientation. I could see it clearly where the casket edges didn't align with the box corners anymore. I stood there trying to rationalize it. Maybe the archaeology team had repositated them incorrectly when they loaded them into the boxes. Maybe I'd misremembered the orientation, but I knew what I'd seen. We'd deliberately turned them east to west during the transfer. I left the tent and locked it. I didn't tell anyone about the rotation. Friday morning, I arrived early and checked the tent before Patricia's team got there. The caskets were oriented east to west again, properly aligned inside their boxes. I felt relieved. I'd been mistaken, tired from the long week. Patricia and her team worked Friday, preparing the caskets for Monday's reburial ceremony. They were careful, respectful, treating each small coffin with dignity. By late afternoon, everything was ready. We locked the tent and went home. Saturday morning, Marcus called me again. He'd come in to do weekend maintenance and heard the knocking again. This time, it wasn't rhythmic. It was frantic, multiple caskets, all at once. He refused to go near the tent. I met him there 20 minutes later. The knocking had stopped, but when I opened the tent, all 12 caskets had rotated back to north-south orientation, and this time 3 of the storage boxes had shifted position, moved several feet from where they'd been, forming a triangular pattern in the center of the tent. I called Patricia. She arrived within the hour. We stood together looking at the displaced boxes, neither of us speaking at first. Finally, she said she'd seen strange things in her career, but nothing like this. She suggested we complete the reburial immediately, that maybe the children didn't want to wait. We worked through the weekend, bypassing the planned ceremony, and reburied all 12 caskets in the children's memorial section by Sunday afternoon. Patricia oriented them north to south, the way we'd found them. She said it felt right. The knocking stopped after that. I've walked past the children's memorial section hundreds of times since then. 12 small headstones, each marked with Unknown Child, Greenbrier Home, 1943. The families who visit sometimes leave flowers or toys. I maintain the section carefully, keeping the grass trimmed and the markers clean, but I've never forgotten the sound Marcus described. 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more, like someone asking to be let out. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, when I'm working nearby, I think I can still hear it, just faintly. 3 knocks from beneath the soil. I don't investigate anymore. Some questions aren't meant to be answered, especially in a cemetery where 12 children were buried facing the wrong direction for 80 years. Last month, a family asked if they could bury their daughter near the memorial section. She was 7 years old. I told them the area was full, that we had other beautiful sections available. They chose a plot in the South Meadow instead, oriented east to west. I've never told anyone why I redirected them. Some sections of Pinewood are reserved for the dead who know which direction they want to face, and some are reserved for the ones still knocking. I've been driving transport trucks for funeral homes and memorial services for 19 years, and I've learned to trust 3 things absolutely: my GPS, my cargo manifest, and the weight sensors on my truck. The night I transported remains from the old plague pit, all 3 betrayed me. My name is David Chen, and I work as a mortuary transport driver for Covenant Memorial Services, a specialty logistics company based in Boston, Massachusetts, that handles sensitive cargo for funeral homes, archaeological sites, and historical recovery projects across New England. When the State Highway Expansion Project near Salem uncovered a mass burial site from 1665, my company was contracted to transport the excavated remains to a new memorial location in Essex County. The site was documented as a plague pit, one of several emergency burial locations used during a cholera outbreak that killed 237 people in a 3-month period. The remains had been recovered over the course of 2 weeks by a forensic archaeology team and were stored in sealed containers at a temporary processing facility near the excavation site. My job was to transport them in batches to Oakwood Memorial Gardens, where they would be reburied with proper ceremony in a dedicated historical section. The first 4 transports went smoothly. Each trip carried approximately 40 containers, and I followed the same route each time. Route 1A south through Peabody, then west on Route 114 to the Memorial Gardens. The GPS tracked my progress, my weight sensors confirmed the cargo load, and I delivered each batch without incident. The 5th transport, the final load, began like at all the others. I arrived at the temporary facility on a Thursday evening in late October. The sun was already setting, and the archaeology team was preparing to close the site permanently after my final pickup. They loaded 43 containers into my truck, which seemed odd because the previous loads had been exactly 40 containers each. I asked the site supervisor, a woman named Dr. Ellen Price, about the discrepancy. She checked her manifest and frowned. "We only have 42 containers left. You sure they loaded 43?" I walked to the truck and counted myself. 43 sealed containers, all properly secured and labeled. Dr. Price recounted her staging area. 42 empty spaces where containers had been stored. She looked confused but exhausted, and she admitted they might have miscounted during the initial intake. She signed off on my transport manifest listing 43 containers, and I began the drive to Oakwood Memorial Gardens. I pulled onto Route 1A at 6:47 in the evening. The GPS showed an estimated arrival time of 7:32, a 45-minute drive I'd made 8 times already. The weight sensors indicated my cargo load was approximately 2,100 pounds, consistent with the previous transports. At 7:05, the GPS recalculated my route. Instead of continuing south on Route 1A, it instructed me to take the next exit and loop back north. I ignored it. The GPS had been reliable throughout the project, but this was clearly an error. I continued south. The GPS recalculated again and again. Every 30 seconds, it kept trying to route me back toward Salem, back toward the excavation site. I turned off the voice guidance and kept driving, following the route I knew by memory. At 7:19, I glanced at my weight sensors. The display showed 2,347 pounds. I'd gained 247 pounds of cargo weight in 14 minutes on an empty highway with no stops. I pulled over at the next rest area and got out of the truck. The cargo bay was sealed, exactly as it had been when I left the facility. I checked the manifest again. 43 containers. I walked around the truck, looking for any explanation. Maybe something had shifted. Maybe I'd picked up road debris, but everything appeared normal. I climbed back into the cab and reset the weight sensors. They recalibrated to 2,347 pounds, not 2,100. I'd gained weight that couldn't be explained. I continued driving. The GPS immediately began routing me back north again. I ignored it. At 7:31, 1 minute before my original estimated arrival time, I was still 15 miles from Oakwood Memorial Gardens. The route I'd taken 8 times before should have delivered me on schedule, but I was nowhere near the destination. The roads looked unfamiliar, and the GPS was now showing me in a location that made no sense, near the original excavation site in Salem, exactly where I'd started. I stopped the truck and checked my odometer. I'd driven 43 miles, the correct distance, but according to the GPS and my physical location, I'd driven in a circle and ended up back at the plague pit. My weight sensors now showed 2,594 pounds. I called my dispatch supervisor, a man named Roger Klein. I explained the situation as calmly as I could. He accessed my truck's tracking system remotely and confirmed what I was seeing. According to the GPS log, I'd been driving in a gradually tightening spiral pattern for the past 45 minutes, and I was now approximately 200 yards from the original excavation site. Roger told me to return to the facility and wait for morning. He said we'd figure out the technical issues with fresh eyes. I agreed, but when I tried to drive away from the excavation site, the GPS routed me back to it. Every turn I made, every road I took, led me in a circle back to the same location. The weight sensors continued climbing. 2,800 pounds, 3,000 pounds, 3,200. I was gaining roughly 47 pounds every 12 minutes. At 8:15, I gave up trying to leave. I parked the truck near the excavation site and waited. The temporary facility was dark, the archaeology team long gone. I sat in the cab with the engine running and watched the weight sensors climb. At 9:32, they reached 3,691 pounds. Then they stopped. I'd gained 1,591 pounds of cargo that didn't exist. Roger sent a second driver to pick me up at 10 in the evening. When that driver arrived, we opened the cargo bay together. 43 containers, all sealed, all exactly where they should be. We counted 3 times. The weight sensors on his truck registered the same impossible cargo weight. We transported the remains to Oakwood Memorial Gardens that night, following behind the second driver. The GPS behaved normally. The weight sensors held steady. We delivered the containers at 11:48. The memorial staff counted them during intake. 42 containers, one was missing. The manifest listed 43. Dr. Price had signed for 43, but only 42 arrived. I never found out which container disappeared or where it went. The memorial staff buried all 42 remains in the historical section, and the site was officially closed. Dr. Price retired from field archaeology shortly afterward and refused to discuss the project when I tried to reach her. My truck was inspected by 3 different mechanics. They found no technical faults with the GPS or weight sensors. Everything functioned perfectly on subsequent transports. I still drive for Covenant Memorial Services, but I don't take historical recovery jobs anymore. I tell Roger I'm focused on standard funeral transport work, and he doesn't push. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving empty highways, my GPS recalculates for no reason. It tries to route me north toward Salem, toward a plague pit that doesn't exist anymore, toward an excavation site that's been paved over and forgotten. I ignore it every time. I've learned that some cargo doesn't want to reach its destination, and some of the dead would rather go back to where they came from than rest in peace somewhere new. The weight sensors in my current truck still work perfectly, but I check them obsessively now, watching for that first unexplained pound, that first sign that something impossible is happening again. So far, the numbers stay steady, but I know what it means when they start to climb. It means someone else is getting in the truck. The city coroner's office sees things that most people spend their entire lives avoiding, but were trained to handle death with clinical detachment. That training didn't prepare me for what we found in the basement of St. Catherine's Hospital. My name is Thomas Voss, and I have served as the city coroner for Newark, New Jersey for 14 years. My job involves death certificates, autopsy reports, and coordination with law enforcement on unexplained fatalities. It's administrative work mostly, paperwork and procedure, but occasionally I'm called to unusual scenes where my expertise is required. The demolition of St. Catherine's Hospital was supposed to be routine historical documentation. Instead, it became the strangest case I've ever handled. St. Catherine's closed in 1997 after filing for bankruptcy, and the building sat empty for 25 years before the city finally approved its demolition to make way for a new community health center. The demolition company was required to conduct a full survey before bringing in the wrecking equipment, checking for asbestos, structural hazards, and any historical artifacts that needed preservation. They found the bricked up morgue on a Tuesday in March of 2022. The construction foreman, a man named Robert Travers, called my office at 2 in the afternoon. His crew had been clearing the basement level when they discovered a section of wall that didn't match the building's original floor plans. Behind the wall was a sealed room, completely dark, with no electrical access and no ventilation. When they broke through, they found a 1950s era morgue that had been deliberately bricked up from the outside. Inside were 31 bodies. I arrived at the site within the hour, along with two investigators from my office, Linda Park and James Wheeler. The hospital basement was cold and damp, lit by temporary work lights the demolition crew had strung up. The bricked up section was in the southeast corner, and the breach point was still dusty with mortar fragments where Travers's crew had broken through. The morgue itself was approximately 20 feet by 30 feet, with old refrigeration units lining one wall, all non-functional. The bodies were on gurneys and exam tables, some partially covered with deteriorating sheets, others exposed. They were in various states of decomposition, but what immediately struck me was how recent they appeared. Bodies from 1952 should have been completely skeletal by now. These looked decades fresher. Linda began photographing, while James and I examined the room for any documentation. We found intake logs, all dated between January and August of 1952. 31 individuals, ranging in age from 17 to 83, all listed as unclaimed deceased with no next of kin. The logs noted they were being held pending county burial, but there was no record of that burial ever taking place. Travers was waiting outside the morgue when we finished our initial survey. He looked shaken. I asked him what was wrong. The infrared scan, he said. We ran a thermal scan of the basement last week before we started demo work. This room showed heat signatures. I told him that was impossible. The room had been sealed for 70 years with no power source. Heat signatures required active thermal activity, electrical systems, HVAC, or living organisms. He showed me the scan results on his laptop. The morgue room clearly showed multiple heat sources, concentrated in the areas where we'd found the bodies. The timestamp on the scan was 3 days before they broke through the wall. I asked for a copy of those results. Travers sent them to my office email immediately. That night, I reviewed the thermal imaging report in detail. The heat signatures were distinct and consistent with human body temperature, approximately 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. There were 31 separate signatures, matching the exact number of bodies we'd found. The scan had been taken 3 days before the wall was breached. I returned to the site the next morning with a full forensic team. We needed to remove the bodies, document everything, and determine whether we were looking at a criminal case or a historical oversight. The medical examiner's office would handle the autopsies and determine approximate time of death for each individual. As we began the removal process, James noticed something wrong with the intake logs. He'd been cross-referencing them against the bodies, trying to match descriptions with the remains. According to the logs, all 31 individuals died in 1952, but the body on Table 7 showed no decomposition at all. The tissue was intact, the skin color normal, the eyes still moist. It looked like someone who died within the past 24 hours. Linda checked body temperature with a digital thermometer, 94.2 degrees. The body had been sealed in a morgue with no climate control, no refrigeration, no power source for 70 years. It shouldn't have any temperature at all. It should have been skeletal remains, just like the others should have been. But it registered 94.2 degrees, only 4 degrees below normal living body temperature. I ordered the team to check temperatures on all 31 bodies. 28 registered between 86 and 90 degrees. 3 registered between 92 and 94 degrees. Every single one showed thermal activity that shouldn't exist. We transported all 31 bodies to the medical examiner's facility that afternoon. The autopsies were scheduled to begin the following Monday, but on Friday, 2 days after we removed the bodies from the morgue, Travers called me again. He'd reviewed additional security footage from the hospital demolition site. The camera that monitored the basement entrance had been running continuously since they started the demo work. He wanted me to see something from the footage recorded on Monday night, the night before they broke through the morgue wall. I met him at the site. He queued up the footage on his laptop. The timestamp showed 11:43 in the evening, 2 days before the wall was breached. The camera angle showed the basement corridor leading to the bricked-up section. The hallway was empty, dark except for a single work light near the stairs. Then, at 11:47, movement. A figure walked into frame from the direction of the bricked-up morgue, moving slowly toward the camera. The image quality was poor, grainy, and washed out by the work light, but I could make out a person wearing what looked like a hospital gown or patient clothing. They walked past the camera and disappeared up the stairs. Travers paused the footage. This was recorded 2 days before we opened that room. No one could have been inside. The wall was solid brick, no openings, no access points. I asked him to show me more. He fast-forwarded through the footage. At 12:13 in the morning, another figure appeared, walking the same path. At 12:39, another. By 2 in the morning, the footage showed 16 separate figures, all walking from the sealed morgue toward the stairs, all wearing similar patient-style clothing. The wall wasn't breached until 47 hours later. I reviewed that footage a dozen times. There was no logical explanation. The room had been sealed since 1952. The thermal imaging confirmed heat signatures 3 days before we opened it. The security footage showed people walking out of a sealed room 2 days before we broke through, and the bodies we removed all showed impossible thermal activity. The medical examiner's office called me on Monday with their preliminary findings. All 31 bodies showed similar decomposition patterns consistent with death occurring between 10 and 15 years ago, not 70 years, not recent. Somewhere, impossibly in between. The autopsy on Body 7, the one that registered 94.2 degrees, revealed something else. Tissue samples showed active cellular processes, not full metabolic function, but something low level, like the cells were suspended in a state between living and dead. The medical examiner, Dr. Sarah Kim, refused to sign off on any official cause of death determinations. She said the findings were biologically impossible, and she wouldn't stake her professional reputation on an explanation she couldn't defend. The city quietly closed the case. The 31 bodies were cremated and their ashes scattered at the county memorial garden with no ceremony and no public record. The hospital demolition was completed in May, and the new health center opened last fall. I still have the thermal imaging report and the security footage. I've shown them to exactly 3 people, Linda, James, and my supervisor. All 3 told me to let it go, that some cases don't have answers. But I think about those heat signatures often, about bodies that shouldn't register temperature, about people walking out of a sealed room that had been bricked up for 70 years. Last month, I drove past the new health center. It's bright and modern, all glass and steel, nothing like the old hospital. Families were walking in for appointments, children playing in the waiting area. I parked across the street and watched for a while. The building sits directly above where that basement morgue used to be, where we found 31 people who'd been waiting in the dark since 1952. I wonder if they're still waiting, if whatever kept them warm for 7 decades is still there, hidden beneath the new foundation, keeping them in that impossible state between death and whatever comes after. The thermal imaging showed heat signatures 3 days before we broke through the wall, but I've never told anyone about the scan I requested last month, the new infrared survey of that section of the health center basement. It showed the same signatures, 31 heat sources exactly where the morgue used to be. I haven't reported it. I probably never will. Some rooms shouldn't be opened, and some walls were bricked up for a reason. I've excavated mass graves from 3 different centuries, but I've never encountered remains that stayed wet in dry soil until the parking garage project in Charleston. My name is Kim Nakamura, and I have worked as a forensic archaeologist, specializing in historical burial recovery for 11 years. What I found beneath the proposed parking structure on Meeting Street challenged everything I understood about decomposition and soil chemistry. The developer contacted my firm in early June of 2023. Ground penetrating radar had detected burial anomalies 6 feet below the construction site. Historical records suggested an overflow cemetery from an 1806 cholera outbreak that killed over 400 people. My job was to oversee excavation, document the remains, and coordinate their transfer before construction proceeded. We began excavation on a Monday. The soil was red Carolina clay, dense and dry despite recent rainfall, standard conditions for the region. We established a grid system and began carefully removing layers of earth. We reached the first remains Tuesday afternoon, a complete skeleton in a deteriorated wood coffin. What immediately struck me was the moisture. The bones were saturated, dripping water as we exposed them. I assumed we'd hit an underground water source. I checked the soil samples, completely dry. Normal moisture content for clay soil in summer, yet the bones were soaking wet. By Thursday, we'd uncovered 23 burials, all showing the same impossible condition: waterlogged remains in bone dry soil. I sent samples to 3 laboratories. All confirmed the same results. Soil was within normal parameters. Water appeared only in direct contact with skeletal remains, as if seeping from the bones themselves. My site supervisor, Marcus Reed, suggested localized groundwater we weren't detecting. I disagreed. The moisture appeared only at burial level, only touching human remains, only within the cholera grave boundaries. Surrounding soil was dry. Friday morning, we uncovered burial 31. This one was positioned differently, curled on its side, hands near the face. This burial was substantially wetter. Water pooled in the excavation grid, requiring pumps before we could continue. When I lifted the skull for photography, water ran from the eye sockets and nasal cavity as if the bone was a sponge. Marcus tested the water. Fresh water, not groundwater, no mineral content, no bacterial contamination, chemically similar to distilled water. That afternoon, the excavation site flooded, no water main break, no rain, no irrigation system, no apparent source. By 3 in the afternoon, 6 inches of standing water submerged the entire grid, originating from the burial level itself. We pumped continuously, but water kept rising faster than equipment could remove it. I called city utilities. Their inspector confirmed no water lines, sewage system, or underground infrastructure could explain the flooding. He tested the water, pure fresh water with no source. We suspended excavation. By Monday morning, the site was completely dry. Soil samples showed normal moisture, but the skeletal remains we'd removed and stored in our processing tent were still saturated, still dripping. I contacted Dr. Ellen Park, who specializes in decomposition processes. She visited Tuesday and examined everything. She had no explanation. The water defied basic principles of soil hydrology and bone chemistry. We completed excavation over 2 weeks, recovering 73 complete sets of remains. All exhibited the same inexplicable moisture, all showed water content that shouldn't exist after 217 years of burial. The remains were transported to Magnolia Cemetery for reburial. I attended the ceremony in late July. Cemetery staff mentioned the burial plots required usually frequent drainage during preparation, despite being in an elevated, well drained section. I didn't tell them about the water. 3 months later, the cemetery groundskeeper called. The memorial section was developing standing wetter around several plots. Soil was becoming oversaturated despite no rain and no irrigation. I visited the following week. 23 of the 73 plots showed visible moisture pooling. The groundskeeper said it started 2 weeks after reburial and had been spreading. Soil engineers tested for springs or pipe leaks. They found nothing. The water was coming from the graves themselves, seeping up through 40 feet of well drained soil. I watched one plot for nearly an hour. The pooling was subtle but constant. By the time I left, water had spread to 3 more adjacent plots. Last month, the cemetery closed the memorial section to new burials. The entire area is now perpetually waterlogged, despite being the highest, driest section. They've installed drainage systems, replaced soil, even excavated and reburied some remains in different locations. The water follows them. I've stopped taking cholera victim recovery projects. When colleagues ask why, I tell them I'm focusing on other time periods, other causes of death. I don't tell them the truth. I don't tell them that some deaths carry water with them, that some illnesses don't stop with burial, that some graves never dry no matter how many years pass, or how much soil is added above them. The parking garage was built on schedule after we completed the recovery. The developer mentioned they had unusual difficulty with the foundation, that they kept encountering unexpected moisture during concrete pouring. They had to install extensive drainage systems and waterproofing that wasn't in the original plans. I never told them why. I never told them. They built on top of a mass grave that refuses to stay buried, that refuses to stay dry, that continues weeping water from the bones of people who died 200 years ago from a disease that claimed over 400 lives in just 2 months. Sometimes, late at night, I think about Burial 31, the one positioned differently, curled on its side with hands near the face, the one wetter than all the others. I wonder if that person died last, if they saw what was happening to the others, if they tried to stop it. I wonder if the water is tears. Every cemetery director learns to trust patterns, but what I saw on those security cameras violated every principle I'd learned in 32 years. My name is Robert Oakes, and I have served as director of Riverside Memorial Park in Columbus, Ohio since 1991. When the city contracted my firm to oversee recovery of remains from a forgotten asylum cemetery uncovered during shopping mall construction, I expected difficult work, but nothing I hadn't handled before. What happened during the 3 weeks of overnight security monitoring changed how I think about what the dead can do when disturbed. The construction site was a 20-acre lot, vacant for 40 years. When developers broke ground in September of 2023, they discovered a burial ground from the 1890s. Ground-penetrating radar revealed 150 burials in neat rows. Historical records confirmed it was Willowbrook Asylum Cemetery, used from 1873 to 1931. We established a processing facility at the site, installed security cameras, and began excavation. The asylum kept meticulous death records, but burial locations were identified only by section numbers, Section 1 through Section 14, each containing 8 to 12 burials. No names, just numbers. Patient 43, Section 7. The dehumanization was systematic. By the first week's end, we'd recovered 32 burials from sections 1 through 3, storing them overnight in the secured processing facility. Monday of the second week, the night guard called before we arrived. Dennis Fletcher, a retired police officer, said I needed to see footage from the previous night. At the construction office, he showed me footage time-stamped 2:47 in the morning. The camera showed our remains containers undisturbed. Then at 2:51, movement appeared in the excavation area, Section 7, where we hadn't excavated yet. Fresh soil disturbance, earth being displaced as if something beneath was shifting. 3 minutes, then it stopped. The excavation grid showed obvious signs of recent digging. Dennis and I walked to Section 7. The disturbance was unmistakable, fresh earth scattered across grid markers, but nothing had emerged. The buried remains were still there at excavation depth. Only surface soil had been displaced. That day, we excavated Section 7 and recovered 11 burials, all positioned normally. Whatever caused the overnight movement hadn't affected the remains themselves. Tuesday night, cameras captured another disturbance in Section 10. Same pattern, 2:53 in the morning, 3 minutes, no visible cause. Wednesday morning showed fresh digging there. Dennis reviewed all overnight footage. Every night since we began, cameras had recorded disturbances in sections we hadn't excavated yet. Different section each night, always between 2:45 and 3 in the morning, always 3 minutes. The pattern was methodical. Section 1 on night 1, Section 2 on night 2, sequential order, as if something was marking them before we arrived. I contacted Dr. Patricia Lewis, a forensic archaeologist. She reviewed the footage Thursday. No explanation, no animal activity would be that regular, that timed. She suggested geological settling, but our surveys showed stable soil. Thursday night, I stayed with Dennis to watch live. At 2:49, Section 11 began moving. We watched soil shift and scatter in real time. The disturbance wasn't random. Earth displaced in rectangular patterns, following burial plot outlines, as if something traced each grave's boundaries from beneath. Dennis and I ran outside. By the time we reached Section 11, movement had stopped. Fresh soil scattered across the section, surface showing rectangular depressions matching exact burial locations. Whatever caused this knew where the graves were. It was marking them for us. Over the following week, we completed all 14 sections. Every night, cameras recorded disturbances in sections scheduled for the next day. Each disturbance lasted 3 minutes, occurred between 2:45 and 3, outlined burial locations with perfect precision. The final night, after recovering all 150 burials, cameras captured one last disturbance. This time, all 14 sections moved simultaneously. By morning, The entire site looked freshly disturbed, as if every burial had been dug and refilled overnight. But we'd already removed all remains. The site was empty. The construction crew began building the mall. The foreman mentioned they kept finding loose soil in rectangular patterns during foundation work, always corresponding to old burial section locations. I reburied all 150 individuals in a memorial section at Riverside Memorial Park. We held proper ceremony, provided named markers when records allowed, treated each burial with dignity. The memorial section is peaceful, well maintained, but I installed security cameras anyway. For 3 weeks after reburial, cameras recorded the same pattern: soil disturbances at 2:45, lasting 3 minutes, moving through memorial sections in numerical order. Section 1, first night, Section 2, second night, through Section 14. Then it stopped. I review overnight footage every morning. 4 months since the last disturbance, the memorial remains peaceful, but I keep cameras running because I understand now what I didn't before. The disturbances weren't trying to escape. They were the asylum patients making sure we found them all, making sure no one was left behind in forgotten graves, making sure each section was properly excavated before we moved on. Section 14 was always the last disturbance, the final marking before everything went quiet, as if someone checked off a list, confirming we'd recovered everyone before allowing us to finish. Last week, a visitor mentioned seeing someone in the memorial section late at night, a figure in old clothing, walking between graves as if counting them. I checked security footage. The cameras showed nothing, but I know what she saw. I know who's still counting, still making sure none are forgotten again. Section 14 isn't just a designation anymore. It's a promise that the last person buried will be remembered, that every numbered grave will be found, that nobody gets left behind. Sometimes I stand at the memorial section at night and watch the numbered markers in the moonlight. 150 graves, all accounted for, all found. The cameras haven't recorded disturbances in 4 months, but I haven't turned them off. Some patterns are meant to be watched. I've managed 12 historical excavations in my career, but I've never transported a casket that unlocked itself during transit until the railway expansion in Virginia. My name is Gabriel Torres, and I have worked as a construction site manager and historical recovery coordinator for Mid-Atlantic Infrastructure Development for 16 years. When railway expansion near Fredericksburg encountered a Civil War burial site, my company coordinated transport from excavation to the medical examiner's facility. What should have been routine became the strangest transport case I've documented. The railway expansion began in March of 2023. During initial grading, our operator noticed unusual soil composition and stopped. Ground penetrating radar confirmed an unmarked burial ground, temporary Civil War burials from the Battle of Fredericksburg, December 1862. The excavation team worked 3 weeks and recovered 17 burials. 15 were skeletal, typical for the conditions. 2 were in sealed metal caskets, preserved remarkably well. One of those caskets became my responsibility on a Tuesday in early April. Dr. Christine Park's team documented it before excavation. Standard military issue metal casket from the 1860s, showing corrosion but structurally intact. The sliding bolt lock was visibly closed, engaged in locked position. The team photographed it extensively, noting it was fully secured before lifting. The casket was transferred to a recovery vehicle for the 3-mile drive to our temporary facility. I followed in my truck. Transport took 15 minutes. When we arrived and began unloading, something was wrong. The casket lid was open, not fully, unsealed, with the lock in open position and the lid raised about 2 inches. The archaeologists in the recovery vehicle hadn't noticed when it happened. They insisted it was secured at loading, and they'd watched it during transport. But during that 15-minute drive, the bolt lock had slid open and the lid had risen. I examined the lock carefully. Corroded but functional, requiring deliberate force to slide from locked to unlocked. Not vibration or jostle. The lock had been manually operated. Dr. Park reviewed her photos. The lock was definitely engaged during excavation. Multiple shots showed it clearly locked, yet now it was open. We decided to document the anomaly and open the casket fully. The body inside was positioned wrong. Civil War burials placed the deceased on their back, hands folded, head west, standard protocol. But these remains were positioned as if trying to sit up, spine curved forward, hands against the underside of the lid rather than folded. Dr. Park examined the positioning. The skeletal articulation suggested movement after burial. The bones weren't in anatomical position for peaceful rest. They were arranged like someone struggling against the casket lid from inside. Then we noticed the scratches. The interior lid showed deep scratch marks, dozens of them, concentrated where the hands would have been. The metal was gouged, scraped, marked by what appeared to be fingernails. The scratches were clear, distinct, but they weren't corroded like the exterior. They looked fresh. I called in Dr. James Wheeler, a metallurgy consultant. He examined the scratches under magnification. The marks showed no oxidation, no patina, no corrosion consistent with 161 years. They appeared recent, within days or weeks. We documented everything and contacted the medical examiner. The remains were transferred for identification. I expected answers. Instead, they found something else. The uniform was authentic Union Army, correctly dated, but under the uniform, pressed against the chest, was paper. It should have deteriorated completely after 16 decades in a sealed casket, but it was intact, legible, recently written. Modern notebook paper. Ballpoint pen, dated April 4th, 2023, the day before we excavated the casket. The message, "Let me out." The medical examiner called me directly. She'd handled thousands of historical remains, never encountered a contemporary note inside a Civil War burial. She asked if someone had placed it as a prank. I reviewed excavation footage. We'd documented everything on video. The casket was never opened in the field. It went directly from excavation to transport to our facility, where we opened it for the first time. No one could have placed that note inside. Yet it was there. written one day before we found the burial, placed inside a casket, sealed underground since 1862. I sealed the case file. I coordinated reburial at Arlington National Cemetery for all 17 recovered service members. The ceremony was respectful, full military honors, but I kept copies, photographs of the open lock, documentation of the scratches, image of that note. 3 months later, Arlington's grounds superintendent called. He wanted to know if the remains I'd coordinated showed unusual characteristics. One grave in the Civil War Memorial section had been disturbed. The ground showed signs of digging from below, as if something tried to push up through soil. Maintenance filled it twice. Twice more, the disturbance reappeared. He gave me the plot number, the soldier from the metal casket, the one with the scratches, the one with the note. I told him it was probably soil settling. He said the pattern was wrong. Soil settling compresses. This looked like something pushing outward. I haven't visited that grave. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that note, how it was dated the day before we excavated, how the scratches looked fresh, despite being inside a sealed coffin for 161 years, how the lock slid open during transport, how no one saw it happen, how the lid raised just enough for us to notice. I wonder if the message wasn't historical, if it wasn't placed by whoever was buried in 1862. I wonder if it was a warning, if the soldier had been trying to communicate for over a century, and we finally excavated him on the exact day he managed to leave a note we could read. Let me out isn't a request from the past. It's a warning about what happens when you don't listen. The casket opened itself. The scratches appeared on metal, too corroded to mark. The note materialized the day before we arrived. I think he was trying to tell us something. I think he's still trying. Last week, I drove past Arlington National Cemetery. I didn't stop. But I thought about that plot number, about that grave that keeps disturbing itself from below. Some caskets aren't meant to stay closed, and some soldiers never stopped fighting. In 11 years of mortuary work, I've processed thousands of skeletal remains, but I've never seen trauma that made the dead look like they were smiling until the tenement fire recovery. My name is Ada Castellano, and I have worked as a mortuary technician at Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office since 2012. My specialty is skeletal analysis and trauma documentation. When the city contracted our office to process remains from a 1923 tenement fire discovered during office building demolition, I expected challenging work, but nothing unusual. What I found in those skulls changed how I think about what happens to bone under extreme stress. The demolition site was in South Philadelphia. When the wrecking crew began excavating the basement in July of 2023, they discovered a sealed chamber containing approximately 40 skeletal remains. Historical records confirmed the location was the Riverside Tenement, a 4-story building that burned in February 1923, killing 38 residents and 2 firefighters. The remains arrived at our facility over 3 days in late July. I laid out each skeleton, documented condition and trauma, prepared preliminary reports. Standard protocol for mass casualty processing. I began with the first remains Thursday morning. Adult male, estimated age 40 to 50. Cause of death consistent with fire, heat damage to bone, smoke inhalation indicators, standard findings. Then I examined the skull. The cranium showed bilateral fractures extending from both temporal regions, curving upward toward the frontal bone and meeting at midline. The fracture lines were symmetrical, positioned in a way that created a distinct curved pattern resembling a smile. The lower mandible showed similar stress fracturing that mirrored the cranial pattern. I documented it as unusual but explainable. Extreme heat can cause unpredictable bone fractures. The second skeleton showed the same pattern. Adult female, similar age, identical bilateral fractures forming the same smile like configuration. By day's end, I'd processed 12 skeletons. All 12 showed identical fracture patterns. Perfect bilateral symmetry, same curved lines, same positioning, creating the appearance of grins when viewed frontally. I reported the pattern to Dr. Marcus Webb, lead forensic anthropologist. He reviewed my documentation and agreed the consistency was unusual, but likely explained by uniform thermal stress during the fire. Friday, I processed 15 more. All 15 showed the pattern. Same symmetry, same positioning, same eerie smile. By this point, I was looking for variations, for any skeleton that didn't match. I found none. Dr. Webb examined them Friday afternoon. He measured fracture angles, documented stress points, compared patterns. His conclusion: the fractures were biomechanically identical, suggesting extremely uniform thermal event. But he looked disturbed. The uniformity was too perfect across 40 different individuals of varying ages and sizes. Saturday, I processed the remaining 13. 12 showed the pattern. The 13th was different. Skeleton 40 showed no fractures. The skull was intact, undamaged, no signs of thermal stress. It was positioned separately, and when I checked excavation documentation, I discovered something strange. Skeleton 40 had been found in the chamber's center, surrounded by all 39 others arranged in a perfect circle. I laid out all 40 skulls, arranging them as they'd been found. 39 skulls with identical smile fractures positioned in a circle. One intact skull in the center. The pattern was deliberate. Someone had arranged these remains intentionally. I called Dr. Webb. He stood looking at the arrangement for 20 minutes without speaking. Finally, he said he'd never seen anything like it. The positioning was too precise to be coincidental. We contacted the lead archaeologist, Dr. Helen Martinez. She examined everything Sunday morning and confirmed the bodies had been found exactly as I'd arranged them, circular pattern with one central burial. Dr. Martinez pointed out something else. The central burial plot had been dug deeper than surrounding graves, as if prepared first, before others were positioned around it. We reviewed historical fire records. 38 residents and 2 firefighters died, 40 total victims. But burial records listed only 39 individuals interred at the site. Skeleton 40, the one without fractures, the one in the center, wasn't documented in any burial record. Dr. Webb examined skeleton 40 carefully. The bones showed no fire damage, no trauma consistent with death by fire or smoke. The individual appeared to have died from natural causes. But this person had been placed in a mass grave for fire victims, positioned centrally, with all others arranged around them in a perfect circle. Monday, the construction foreman called. His crew refused to continue demolition. After excavating the burial chamber, workers reported seeing a circular disturbance pattern in the soil where graves had been. The arrangement was still visible after remains were removed. One worker had photographed the burial chamber before removal. When he reviewed the photo, he noticed all 39 skulls in the circular arrangement were oriented inward, facing the central grave, all looking at skeleton 40. The foreman sent me the photo. He was right. Every skull faced center, directed toward the one grave that didn't match. We completed analysis and submitted our report. Cause of death for 39 individuals, thermal trauma consistent with structure fire. Cause of death for individual 40, undetermined. The remains were released for reburial at Mount Peace Cemetery. The city held a ceremony honoring the victims. All 40 were buried in linear arrangement. But I kept the excavation photos, the skull measurements, the documentation of those identical fracture patterns. 3 weeks after reburial, Mount Peace's grounds supervisor called. The memorial section was developing unusual settlement. The graves were sinking in a circular configuration around one central plot, the plot where we'd buried skeleton 40. He'd contacted soil engineers. All confirmed stable soil with no structural reason for the settlement pattern. The graves were rearranging themselves. 40 graves in a perfect circle around one central burial, exactly as they'd been found. I haven't visited the memorial section. I don't want to see if the pattern has fully reformed. But sometimes I think about those fractures, about how perfectly symmetrical they were across 39 skulls, about how they looked like smiles. I think about skeleton 40, the one without trauma, the one everyone faced. And I wonder if those fractures weren't caused by fire, if they were caused by something else that happened before the tenement burned, something that made 39 people arrange themselves in a circle around one central figure. I wonder if they were smiling because they'd finally found who they were looking for. Some patterns are meant to stay buried, and some circles are never meant to be broken. After 28 years managing cemetery operations, I thought I understood how the dead stayed positioned after burial until I started finding bodies that rearranged themselves overnight. My name is Margaret Hayes, and I have served as cemetery director at Greenwood Memorial Gardens in Chicago, Illinois, since 1995. When the city's metro expansion required relocating a potter's field from 1890, I expected straightforward recovery and reburial. What I discovered during 3-week processing violated every principle of post-mortem positioning I'd learned. The Metro Tunnel project began in August of 2023, extending the Blue Line beneath what had been an industrial district in the late 1800s. Ground-penetrating radar detected a burial ground 15 feet below street level. Historical records confirmed it was a potter's field, unmarked mass grave for indigent deceased from 1887 to 1893. The site contained approximately 120 burials. The city contracted an archaeological firm to excavate, and my cemetery provided temporary processing and permanent reburial locations. We established a climate-controlled storage facility in our maintenance building for cataloging. The excavation team worked 2 weeks recovering all 120 remains. Each was documented, photographed, and transferred to our facility in labeled containers. By Friday, September 8th, all were in our storage, properly organized. Dr. Vincent Park conducted final inventory Friday afternoon, confirmed everything was documented, and released the remains to our care. We locked the facility at 6 in the evening. Monday morning, my groundskeeper, Thomas Reed, came to my office looking confused. He said I needed to see something before we started work. In the storage facility, Container 87 had been opened and the skeletal remains repositioned. When Dr. Park's team placed the remains Friday, the skeleton was positioned supine. Now it was different. Hands covering eye sockets, body facing true north, knees drawn up in protective posture. I checked facility locks, no tampering. Security cameras showed no one entering over the weekend. The facility had been sealed from Friday evening until Monday morning, yet the remains had been repositioned. I examined nearby containers. 3 others, 84, 88, and 90, showed the same positioning. Hands covering eyes, facing true north, knees drawn up. These 4 skeletons were arranged identically, and according to Dr. Park's documentation, none had been positioned this way during excavation. I called Dr. Park. He reviewed documentation and confirmed all 4 had been recovered in standard supine position. He had no explanation. We documented the anomaly and continued processing. By Monday evening, we'd processed 23 containers. All remains were returned to supine position before locking up. Tuesday morning, 5 more skeletons were positioned identically, hands covering eyes, facing true north, knees drawn up. 2 were from containers we'd processed Monday and specifically positioned supine. They'd rearranged overnight. I reviewed security footage. The facility cameras showed containers from 8 in the evening until 6 in the morning. Nothing moved, no one entered. But when we opened container 41 Tuesday morning, the remains were positioned differently than Monday evening. The skeleton had repositioned between camera frames. Dr. Park visited Tuesday afternoon. He examined the repositioned remains and security footage. He asked about seismic activity. I contacted City Geological Survey. No seismic events, no construction vibration, no environmental factors that could explain movement. By Friday, September 15th, 43 of the 120 skeletons were positioned identically, hands covering eyes, facing true north, protective posture. The pattern was spreading. Each morning revealed more skeletons had adopted the position overnight. I contacted Dr. Ellen Martinez, a forensic anthropologist specializing in burial archaeology. She examined the remains Friday afternoon. The positioning was deliberate and impossible through natural settling. Skeletons don't spontaneously rearrange to face specific compass directions. Yet 43 had done exactly that. Dr. Martinez suggested we examine original excavation data. Perhaps these 43 had been buried this way. Dr. Park's excavation photographs proved an otherwise. All 120 burials had been documented in standard positions. None showed hands covering eyes configuration. The repositioning was happening in our facility overnight while in our care. Weekend footage showed the same pattern. No movement visible, but Monday morning revealed 17 additional repositionings. We were now at 60 skeletons in identical configuration. I made a decision Tuesday of the third week. We would rebury all remains immediately, bypassing planned processing. Whatever caused the repositioning, I wanted these individuals properly interred. We worked Tuesday through Thursday, conducting rapid reburials. All 120 were buried by Thursday evening, September 21st. Each positioned supine, hands at sides, oriented east-west per traditional cemetery practice. Friday morning, the groundskeeping crew reported disturbances. 63 graves showed soil displacement, subtle settlement, suggesting movement beneath the surface. I knew which graves without checking. The 63 skeletons that had repositioned in storage. Over the following week, disturbances intensified. By September's end, all 63 graves showed significant settlement. Something beneath was shifting, creating voids that caused surface collapse. I authorized excavation of one grave to investigate. We selected grave 87, the first that had repositioned in storage. When we reached coffin level, the remains were positioned exactly as in storage. Hands covering eyes, body rotated to face true north, despite being buried east-west, knees drawn up. The skeleton had repositioned inside a sealed coffin, buried 4 feet underground. We reburied grave 87 without further investigation. I filed a report noting settlement, but didn't detail the repositioning. By mid-October, all 63 graves had stabilized. Disturbances stopped. The historical section remained peaceful, but every morning I walk through that section and count the graves. 63 burials that rearranged themselves, that chose a position different from how we laid them to rest, that insisted on facing true north with hands covering their eyes. I think about the other 57 graves, the individuals who didn't reposition. I wonder what's different about them. Last week, grave 41 showed fresh settlement. It had been stable for 2 months. When groundskeeping investigated, soil had collapsed into a void below, as if something shifted position recently. I checked my records. Grave 41 was one of the 57 that hadn't repositioned during storage. Now it's 64. The pattern is still spreading, converting burials one at a time to identical configuration. Hands covering eyes, facing true north, knees drawn up as if protecting against something. I've stopped processing historical remains at Greenwood. When the city asks if we can accommodate recovery projects, I tell them our historical section is at capacity. I walk through the historical section every morning. I count the settled graves. Yesterday, 67. This morning, 71. And every morning, more of them are turning to face it. I've worked night security at construction sites for 23 years, but I've never seen someone walk through a mass grave excavation who wasn't part of the crew until the hotel project on Beacon Street. My name is Marcus Fleming, and I work as a groundskeeper and night security supervisor for Heritage Construction Services in Boston, Massachusetts. When we're contracted for projects involving historical excavation, I oversee overnight security to protect exposed remains from vandalism. The hotel construction site that uncovered a mass grave from a 1907 boarding house collapse should have been standard work. Instead, it became the strangest surveillance case I've documented in 2 decades. The excavation began in late October of 2023 after ground penetrating radar detected a burial anomaly beneath the hotel foundation. Historical records confirmed the location had been the Beacon Hill boarding house, which collapsed during a nor'easter in March 1907. 67 residents died, and they were buried in a mass grave on the property itself before the lot was paved over. The archaeological team worked during daylight hours. My job was securing the site from 6 in the evening until 6 in the morning, monitoring security cameras and conducting hourly perimeter checks. The first week was routine. Saturday night was when I saw her. The timestamp on camera 3 showed 11:47 in the evening. The excavation area was empty, properly secured. Then a woman walked into frame. She wore a long dark dress, period clothing from the early 1900s. She moved slowly between the excavation trenches, pausing at specific locations, kneeling as if examining the ground. She spent 4 minutes on camera before walking toward the eastern edge. I checked camera 5, which covered the eastern perimeter. Nothing. She never appeared on the exit camera. I conducted an immediate perimeter check. The site was secured, all entry points locked. The processing tent, holding 18 recovered remains, was undisturbed. At 12:33, camera 3 captured her again. This time, she knelt at 7 different locations, touching the soil at each spot. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the excavation area. 90 seconds. When I arrived, no one was there, but 7 locations showed fresh soil disturbance, exactly where she'd been kneeling. Sunday morning, I showed the footage to Dr. Helen Park, the lead archaeologist. The 7 locations corresponded to burial sites scheduled for excavation the following week, detected by ground penetrating radar but not yet uncovered. Dr. Park couldn't explain it. The pattern continued for 2 weeks. Every night between 11:30 and 2 in the morning, the woman appeared. She marked locations, and the excavation team found remains there the next day. Every single time. By the 3rd week, 63 victims had been recovered. 4 remained undiscovered. Thursday night, the woman appeared at 10:52. She walked to 4 specific locations in unstable soil the team had been avoiding. She knelt at each spot, placed her hand flat on the ground, and remained motionless. Then she turned and looked directly at camera 3, at me. She raised 4 fingers, held them to the camera, then pointed to each location in sequence. Friday, the excavation team found all 4 remaining victims exactly where she'd indicated. 67 complete recoveries, matching the historical record perfectly. Friday night was my last shift. I sat in the security trailer expecting to see her one final time. She appeared at 11:47. She walked to the processing tent where all 67 remains waited for reburial. She stood outside, bowed her head, placed both hands over her heart, then turned to face camera 3. I could see her face clearly. Young, mid-20s, dark hair, sad expression. She looked directly at the camera and mouthed 2 words. Thank you. Then she walked toward the eastern perimeter. This time, camera 5 captured her. She walked to the edge of the construction site and simply faded from view, not walking out of frame, fading, becoming translucent, disappearing like morning fog. I filed my final security report, documenting everything. The construction company archived it without comment. The 67 victims were reburied at Forest Hills Cemetery. I attended the ceremony, looking for a young woman in a dark dress who'd spent 3 weeks making sure we found everyone. I didn't see her, but that night I reviewed the cemetery's surveillance footage. At 11:47, a figure appeared on the memorial section cameras. A woman in period dress, walking between the 67 new graves, pausing at each one as if counting. When she reached 67, she stopped, bowed her head, and disappeared. I've worked a dozen excavation security jobs since. I've never seen her again. She was specific to Beacon Hill, specific to those 67 victims, specific to making sure they were all found. But now I watch cameras differently. I look for figures in period dress, for people who appear without entering and disappear without leaving, for the ones who count graves and mark locations. Because I understand now that sometimes the dead help us find them. Sometimes they're guiding, making sure their community isn't left behind in unmarked soil. The woman on Beacon Street spent 3 weeks showing me where to look. She made sure all 67 were recovered before she finally rested. I never learned her name. She wasn't listed in any historical documentation, but I know she was there the night of the collapse, and I know she waited 116 years to make sure everyone came home. Sometimes I think about how many others are out there, waiting in unmarked graves, hoping someone will listen when they try to show us where they're buried. How many are still counting, still marking locations, still refusing to be forgotten? The Beacon Hill woman found her voice through security cameras and soil disturbances. She communicated the only way she could, using the tools we'd provided to monitor the site. She turned our surveillance system into her method of guidance. I wonder if other burial sites have similar guardians, people who died together and refused to let their companions stay lost, people who find ways to communicate across centuries, who manipulate our technology and our perceptions just enough to point us in the right direction. The construction on Beacon Street is complete now. The hotel opened 6 months ago. I drove past it last week and thought about those 3 weeks of surveillance footage, about the woman who appeared every night at 11:47, about how she guided us to every single burial before saying goodbye. Some night visitors aren't intruders. Some are guardians who never left their post. In 15 years of forensic archaeology, I've excavated mass graves on 4 continents, but I've never encountered remains that made sound before we uncovered them until the subway station project beneath Market Street. My name is Dr. Amira Shah, and I lead forensic investigation teams for the Philadelphia Archaeological Consortium. When the city's transit authority discovered a mass burial site during subway expansion in October 2023, I was contracted to oversee the excavation of what historical records suggested was an 1800 workhouse cemetery containing approximately 80 individuals. The audio recordings we captured during that 3 week excavation remain the most disturbing evidence I've collected in my career. The subway station expansion began in early October, extending the Market Frankfurt line deeper into Center City. When tunnel boring equipment encountered unexpected resistance at 18 feet below street level, ground penetrating radar revealed a large burial anomaly. Historical documentation confirmed this had been the Philadelphia Municipal Workhouse Cemetery, used from 1800 to 1843 for indigent burials. Records suggested 83 individuals had been interred in this section. My team established excavation protocols and began work on Monday, October 16th. We installed audio recording equipment to document the excavation process, standard procedure for our projects. The recorders capture ambient sound, team communications, and any unusual acoustic phenomena. The first 3 days proceeded normally. We recovered 7 complete sets of remains. The audio recordings captured standard excavation sounds. Thursday night, the overnight security guard called me at 3:24 in the morning. He said I needed to hear something from the site. I arrived at 3:57. The guard, Peter Torres, played back audio from the site recorder. The timestamp showed 3:17. For 30 seconds, the recording captured typical nighttime ambient sound. Then, at 3:17 and 42 seconds, a sound began. Rhythmic knocking, hollow and distant, like someone tapping on wood. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks, a pause. The pattern repeated 17 times before stopping. Peter had been conducting a perimeter check when he heard it, coming from the excavation area. By the time he reached the site, the sound had stopped. I reviewed the recorder data. The knocking originated from approximately 12 to 15 feet below the surface, the depth where we'd been detecting burial anomalies but hadn't yet excavated. Friday night at 3:17, the knocking began again. Multiple audio recorders captured it. The sound originated from Section 15, an area scheduled for excavation Monday. Same rhythm, 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, repeating for 97 seconds. I analyzed the frequency and acoustic properties. It was consistent with wood-on-wood contact, specifically knuckles or finger bones striking wood from inside an enclosed space. Saturday night at 3:17, the pattern changed. The knocking came from three different locations simultaneously, sections 15, 18, and 22, all areas we hadn't excavated yet, all producing the identical three-knock rhythm, synchronized perfectly. I stayed on site Saturday night with two team members, Dr. Vincent Cole and graduate researcher Sarah Martinez. We positioned ourselves near the excavation area with portable recording equipment. At 3:17, the knocking began. All three of us heard it clearly, rhythmic, hollow, originating from beneath the soil in multiple locations. We attempted to triangulate the exact source using directional microphones. The sound came from burial depth, from areas where ground penetrating radar showed coffin sized anomalies. The knocking stopped at 3:19. We excavated section 15 immediately, working through the night. We reached burial level at 5:33 and found a deteriorated coffin containing skeletal remains positioned normally. No evidence of disturbance, no mechanism that could explain the knocking. The pattern expanded Sunday night. 7 locations produced knocking. Monday night 12, Tuesday night 18. The correlation was perfect. If we recorded knocking from a specific grid location, we found remains there during excavation. The knocking was a map. Something was telling us where to dig. Wednesday of the third week, we'd recovered 67 sets of remains. Historical records indicated 83 total burials. 16 remained undiscovered. That night at 3:17, 16 different locations produced the knocking simultaneously. Dr. Cole suggested we were experiencing acoustic phenomenon, perhaps structural resonance from subway construction. But the sounds occurred every night at precisely 3:17, regardless of construction activity. Thursday night, I stayed on site alone with full recording equipment. At 3:17, the knocking began. All 16 remaining locations, all synchronized. But this time, I heard something else beneath the knocking rhythm. Voices, counting. Someone was counting in rhythm with the knocks. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Over and over, 16 different voices, all counting together. I recorded 7 minutes of audio. When I analyzed it later, I could identify distinct vocal patterns, different pitches, different cadences, 16 separate voices maintaining identical rhythm. Friday morning, we excavated all 16 remaining locations based on the knocking map. We found remains at every single site, 83 complete recoveries, matching the historical record exactly. Friday night at 3:17, I sat in the empty excavation area with my recording equipment, waiting to see if the knocking would continue now that we'd recovered all the remains. Silence, no knocking, no voices. The site remained quiet. Through the entire night, we completed documentation and released the remains for reburial. All 83 individuals were interred at Mount Peace Cemetery in a memorial section dedicated to the workhouse victims. I kept copies of all audio recordings. I've analyzed them repeatedly, played them for colleagues, submitted them to acoustic specialists. No one can explain the knocking or the counting voices, but I know what I heard. 16 voices counted in unison at 3:17 every morning, marking locations where their remains waited to be found. They stopped counting the night after we recovered the last burial. 3 months ago, the Transit Authority contacted me about another excavation project, another fate's burial during construction, this one from the 1850s. I declined. I told them my schedule was too full. The truth is, I installed audio recorders at my home after the workhouse excavation. Every night at 3:17, I monitor the recordings, listening for knocking, for counting, for voices that shouldn't exist. So far, my home recordings have been silent, but I keep the equipment running because I learned something during those 3 weeks beneath Market Street. The dead can communicate if we're willing to listen. They can count, can mark their locations, can tell us where they're buried if we pay attention to the sounds they make from beneath the soil. The knocking was never random. It was systematic, purposeful, timed precisely to draw our attention. 83 people buried in unmarked graves, forgotten by history, using the only method available to make sure we found them all. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more knocks. The rhythm of someone asking to be remembered, asking to be found, asking not to be left behind in darkness. I've coordinated mortuary transport for historical excavations across 3 states over 19 years, but I've never delivered more remains than I picked up until the downtown renovation project uncovered the plague mass grave. My name is Glenn Morrison, and I serve as transport supervisor for Northeast Memorial Logistics, a specialty company handling sensitive cargo transportation for funeral homes and archaeological recovery projects. When Philadelphia's downtown renovation discovered a mass burial site from an 1820 plague outbreak, my company was contracted to transport the recovered remains from the excavation site to the city medical examiner's facility. The inventory discrepancy we discovered during that transport violated every principle of cargo handling I've learned in nearly 2 decades. The excavation team had worked for 3 weeks recovering remains from what historical records identified as an emergency plague burial from July 1820. The outbreak killed approximately 200 people in a 6 week period, and they were buried in a mass grave on what had been the outskirts of the city. My company received the transport request on Thursday, November 9th, 2023. The archaeological firm had completed their recovery and documentation. 200 complete sets of skeletal remains were cataloged, photographed, and prepared for transport in sealed containers. I assigned 3 trucks and 6 crew members to the transport. Each remain set was in an individual container, clearly labeled with excavation identification numbers 1 through 200. We loaded the trucks. Thursday afternoon, 67 containers in truck 1, 67 in truck 2, and 66 in truck 3. I verified the count personally before we departed. 200 containers. I signed the transport manifest and led the convoy toward the medical examiner's facility. The drive should have taken 35 minutes. We arrived at 4:42. The receiving team began unloading immediately. Standard protocol requires counting during unload. The receiving coordinator, Dr. Patricia Wells, counted as her team transferred containers. She counted 203 containers. I told her to recount. We'd loaded exactly 200. She counted again with me observing directly. 203 sealed containers, all labeled with excavation identification numbers. I checked my trucks. Empty. I reviewed the loading documentation. 200 containers loaded, clearly documented with photographs and signed manifests, but 203 containers had been delivered. Dr. Wells examined the extra 3 containers. They were identical to the others. The identification numbers were 201, 202, and 203, sequential numbers following the original series. I called the excavation site supervisor, Dr. Marcus Reed. He reviewed his documentation and was adamant. Only 200 remains had been recovered. His final inventory, completed that morning before we arrived, confirmed 200 containers, numbers 1 through 200. He'd personally supervised the loading. 200 containers went onto our trucks. Dr. Wells opened container 201. Inside was a complete skeleton, properly positioned, showing the same degradation and soil characteristics as the other plague burial remains, indistinguishable from the documented recoveries. We opened containers 202 and 203. Both contained complete skeletons. Both appeared consistent with the 1820 burial conditions. But they hadn't been excavated. They hadn't been documented. They hadn't been loaded at the site. They'd appeared during transport. I reviewed our convoy security footage. All 3 trucks had dashboard cameras recording the entire journey. I checked truck 1 first, which had been carrying the 3 extra containers according to unloading documentation. The interior cargo camera showed 67 containers loaded at the excavation site. During the drive, at approximately 4:17, the camera briefly glitched, 3 seconds of static, then clear footage resumed. After the glitch, 70 containers were visible in the cargo bay. 3 containers had appeared during a 3-second camera malfunction. I showed the footage to Dr. Wells. She contacted the city medical examiner, Dr. Helen Park, who reviewed everything and requested we document the anomaly but proceed with standard processing. Over the following week, the medical examiner's office conducted detailed analysis on all 203 sets of remains. The forensic anthropologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, found that all showed consistent burial conditions, similar age at death demographics, and identical post-mortem intervals. Every skeleton appeared to be from the same mass burial event, including the 3 that shouldn't exist. Dr. Chen examined the 3 extra skeletons specifically. She found nothing unusual. They were by every measurable criterion identical to the others. Same age range, same burial trauma patterns, same soil mineral deposits. The only difference was that containers 201 through 203 had no excavation documentation. Dr. Reed conducted a complete re-examination of the excavation site. Ground-penetrating radar showed no remaining burial anomalies. The plague mass grave had been fully excavated. 200 individuals recovered, nothing left behind. Yet we delivered 203. The medical examiner's office held the remains for 6 weeks while investigating the discrepancy. No one could explain where the 3 extra skeletons came from. City records from 1820 confirmed approximately 200 deaths during the plague outbreak. Mass burial documentation from the period listed near 200 souls interred at the emergency site. Not 203. 200. But 203 complete skeletons now existed in the medical examiner's storage facility. In January 2024, the city made a decision. All 203 individuals would be reburied together in the plague memorial section. The 3 undocumented remains would receive the same respect and ceremony as the others. I attended the reburial ceremony on January 26th. 203 graves in the memorial section, all marked with simple stones noting Philadelphia Plague Victim 1820. But I kept watching the 3 graves at the end of the last row, numbers 201, 202, and 203, the ones that appeared in my truck during a 3-second camera glitch. After the ceremony, I requested copies of all documentation, the camera footage, and Dr. Chen's forensic analysis. I've reviewed everything repeatedly, trying to find a rational explanation for how 3 complete skeletons appeared in a sealed truck during a routine drive across the city. Last month, I declined a transport contract for another plague mass grave recovery from Baltimore. The logistics coordinator asked why. I told them my schedule was too full. I didn't tell them the truth. I didn't tell them I've started checking my trucks obsessively between loading and delivery, that I count cargo 3 times at pickup, twice during transport, and 4 times at delivery, that I review every second of security camera footage looking for glitches. Because I learned something during that November transport. I learned that not everyone buried in mass graves gets documented, that some remain behind in the soil, uncounted, unrecorded, forgotten by history. And I learned that sometimes they find another way to join the reburial, that they can appear in sealed trucks during 3-second camera malfunctions, that they can add themselves to the count, that they refuse to be left behind when their companions are finally being laid to rest properly. The plague records said 200 died. We excavated 200, but 203 are buried in that memorial section. I think about those 3 extra graves often, about skeletons that appeared from nowhere, that matched the others perfectly, that seemed to belong to the same burial event, despite never being excavated. I wonder how many other mass graves have uncounted dead. How many remain behind when excavations are marked complete, when manifests are signed, when transport trucks drive away with everyone except the ones history forgot to document. I still work in mortuary transport, but I count differently now. And when the numbers don't match, when extra containers appear during camera glitches, I don't question it anymore. I just make sure they all reach the memorial. All of them. Even the ones who weren't supposed to be there. Because sometimes 3 seconds of static is all it takes for the forgotten to finally be counted. After 13 years conducting archaeological excavations, I thought I understood how burial sites remain static over time until I encountered graves that moved every time we scanned them. My name is Dr. Jonathan Reeves, and I work as a site archaeologist for the Massachusetts Archaeological Survey. When a shopping center excavation in Worcester uncovered what appeared to be a forgotten asylum cemetery from the late 1800s, I was contracted to oversee the recovery of approximately 40 burial sites detected by ground penetrating radar. The systematic repositioning of those burial locations during our 3-week documentation period represents the most scientifically inexplicable phenomenon I've witnessed in my career. The shopping center development began in September 2023 on land that had been vacant industrial property for decades. Initial grading work revealed brick foundations consistent with institutional architecture from the 1870s. Historical research confirmed the site had been Brookside Asylum, a psychiatric facility that operated from 1871 to 1913. Ground penetrating radar conducted in early October revealed 40 distinct burial anomalies in what would have been the asylum's western grounds. The burials were arranged in a rough grid pattern consistent with institutional cemetery practices. Based on asylum records, we estimated these were patient burials from individuals who died without family claims or financial resources. I began excavation planning on October 9th, establishing our documentation grid and scheduling the phased recovery process. Standard protocol requires multiple radar scans to verify burial locations before excavation begins. We conducted our baseline scan on Monday, October 9th, marking all 40 burial positions. Tuesday morning, October 10th, we conducted our verification scan. The burial positions had shifted, not significantly. The changes ranged from 18 inches to 4 feet, but all 40 anomalies had moved from their Monday positions. I assumed equipment calibration error and conducted a third scan Tuesday afternoon using different radar equipment. The results matched the Tuesday morning scan. The burials had moved overnight. I reviewed our Monday scan data carefully. The readings were clear, properly calibrated, showing 40 distinct burial anomalies in specific locations. Tuesday's scans showed those same 40 anomalies in different positions. Wednesday morning, we conducted another verification scan. The positions had shifted again. All 40 burial locations had moved, some by as much as 6 feet. The grid pattern remained consistent, but the entire formation had rotated approximately 15 degrees and shifted northeast. I contacted Dr. Patricia Morris, a colleague who specializes in radar interpretation. She visited Wednesday afternoon and reviewed our scan data. She confirmed the readings were accurate. The burial locations were definitely changing between scans. She suggested geological movement or soil settling, but the site had been stable for over a century. The radar indicated solid, compacted soil with no voids or instabilities. Thursday morning's scan showed another shift. This time, the burial pattern had contracted, pulling all 40 locations closer together as if clustering around some central point. I made a decision to excavate immediately. We began Thursday afternoon, working from the Thursday morning scan coordinates. We excavated the first location and found nothing, no signs of burial, no coffin fragments, no bone material. We tried the second location, empty. Third location, empty. We excavated 8 locations and found nothing at any of them. Friday morning, we conducted another scan. All 40 burial anomalies had moved again, clustering even tighter around a central location we identified as point zero, the approximate geometric center of the original grid formation. I noticed something else. The burial pattern now resembled a spiral, with the 40 locations arranged in a curved formation rotating around point zero. The mathematical precision was unsettling. We excavated 3 locations from Friday's scan, all empty. Saturday morning, I arrived at 5:30 to conduct a dawn scan. The scan showed all 40 anomalies had converged on point zero. 40 distinct readings, all occupying the same central location. I marked point zero and waited for my team. At 8 in the morning, we began excavating the central location. At 6 feet down, we found a single burial. One complete skeleton, positioned supine in a deteriorated wood coffin. Adult male, estimated age 50 to 60, standard asylum burial, but the radar was still showing 40 anomalies at this location. I conducted another scan with the skeleton exposed. The radar showed 40 burial signatures, all at this exact location. We were looking at one skeleton, but the radar insisted there were 40. Sunday, I reviewed all our scan data chronologically. The pattern was clear. Every scan showed the burials moving closer together, converging on point zero, clustering until all 40 occupied the same spatial coordinates. The migration was systematic, following a geometric pattern that suggested intentional movement. I contacted Dr. Marcus Webb, a forensic anthropologist, to examine the skeleton. He visited Monday and conducted detailed analysis. The remains showed no unusual characteristics. Standard 1800s burial, showing normal decomposition patterns. Monday afternoon, we excavated outward from point zero in a radial pattern, looking for the other 39 burials. We dug 23 test trenches extending 40 feet in all directions. We found nothing. Tuesday morning, I conducted another radar scan. The pattern had reversed. All 40 anomalies were spreading outward from point zero, moving back toward the original grid formation. By Tuesday evening, the burial locations had returned to approximately their October 9th positions. Wednesday morning's scan showed the positions matched our original baseline scan almost exactly. The burials had completed a full cycle, converging to point zero, then expanding back to their starting positions. Thursday morning, the cycle began again. All 40 locations started moving toward point zero, following the same spiral pattern. I documented the pattern for 2 complete cycles. Every 7 days, the burial locations converged on point zero, then expanded back to their original positions. The movement was consistent, predictable, following mathematical precision that defied geological explanation. The excavation firm recommended I submit a final report and conclude the project. They wanted to proceed with construction and avoid further delays. I wrote my report carefully, documenting the radar readings without attempting to explain them. I noted we'd recovered one burial at the central convergence point, and that additional excavation had revealed no other skeletal remains. The shopping center construction proceeded. They built over the site, paving where the asylum cemetery had been. But I kept all the radar scan data. I review it regularly, studying the convergence pattern, the spiral formation, the mathematical precision of the movement cycles. Last month, the shopping center manager contacted me. They were experiencing unusual foundation issues. The floor showed stress cracks forming in a radial pattern, all extending from one central point. I asked them to send structural engineering diagrams. The crack pattern was identical to the spiral formation the burials had followed during convergence. The cracks appeared and disappeared on a 7-day cycle. Each week they formed, spreading outward from the center. Each week they faded and the floor returned to normal. I haven't told them what I think is happening. I haven't told them that 40 burials are still moving beneath their shopping center, still following the same convergence pattern, still clustering around point zero every 7 days. I think about that single burial at point zero, about how the radar showed 40 signatures at one location, but we only found one, about how 39 burials seem to cluster around a single grave. I think about asylum patients, about institutional deaths, about people buried in numbered graves without names or families, about how they might stay together even in death, clustering around one central figure every 7 days. The asylum cemetery is gone, paved over and built upon. But the burials never stopped moving, and then every 7 days they come together at point zero, where one person waits for 39 others to gather around them in the dark. In 26 years as a funeral director, I've handled every type of burial anomaly documented in mortuary science, but I've never received caskets that sealed themselves from the inside until the factory fire recovery arrived at my facility. My name is Victor Novak, and I have operated Riverside Funeral Services in Minneapolis, Minnesota since 1997. My firm specializes in historical burial services, working with archaeological teams to provide dignified reinterment for remains recovered from forgotten cemeteries. When the city contacted me about handling 52 victims from an 1889 factory fire discovered during apartment construction, I expected challenging restoration work, but nothing beyond my experience. The 3 empty caskets that arrived sealed with fresh scratches on their interior surfaces changed my understanding of what the dead can do when they refuse to stay buried. The excavation site was in North Minneapolis, where a new apartment complex was being built on vacant land. Construction crews discovered a mass burial site approximately 8 feet below the surface, containing remains of workers who died in the Riverside Manufacturing Company fire of March 1889. Historical records documented 52 casualties, all buried in a mass grave on company property when families couldn't afford private burials. The archaeological recovery team worked through October 2023, carefully excavating and documenting each set of remains. The city contracted my firm to receive the remains, conduct restoration where possible, and coordinate reburial in a memorial section at Forest Hills Cemetery. The remains arrived in sealed caskets over 3 days in late October. Each casket was labeled with an identification number corresponding to excavation documentation. The manifest listed 52 complete recoveries. My preparation staff, led by head mortician Elena Rodriguez, began processing on Monday, October 30th. Standard protocol: open each casket, assess the remains, document condition, prepare for reburial ceremony. Tuesday morning, Elena came to my office with a concern. Casket number 17 had been delivered sealed, but when she opened it for processing, she found something unusual. The remains were positioned normally, but the interior of the casket lid showed scratch marks, deep gouges in the wood lining, concentrated near where the hands would have been positioned. I examined the casket personally. The scratch marks were unmistakable, clearly made by fingernails drawn across the wood with significant force. The marks were fresh, showing no age or deterioration. But casket 17 contained remains from 1889, skeletal remains that had been underground for 134 years. Fresh scratches couldn't exist on a casket buried since the 1800s. Elena continued processing. Wednesday morning, she reported the same finding in casket 23. Fresh scratch marks on the interior lid, identical pattern to casket 17. Thursday brought the same discovery in casket 31. All three caskets had been documented as sealed when excavated. The archaeological team had photographed them closed, with original locking mechanisms engaged, but the interior surfaces showed recent damage. By Friday, November 3rd, we'd processed 49 of the 52 caskets. 3 remained for Monday processing, numbers 12, 37, and 45. Monday morning, Elena and I opened casket number 12 together. It was empty. Not empty because the remains had been removed, empty as if nothing had ever been inside. The casket lining was intact, undisturbed, showing no compression patterns or organic residue that would indicate skeletal material had ever been present. But the interior lid showed scratch marks identical to the 3 previous caskets. The casket had been sealed from the inside, scratched from the inside, but contained no remains. We opened casket 37, empty, with interior scratch marks. Casket 45, the same. 3 empty caskets, all sealed, all scratched internally, all delivered from an excavation that should have contained 52 complete burials. I called the excavation supervisor, Dr. Marcus Park. He reviewed his documentation and was adamant. 52 caskets had been prepared, all containing skeletal remains, all sealed and transported to my facility. His photographs showed remains in all 52 caskets before they were sealed for transport, but 3 were empty when we received them. Dr. Park came to my facility that afternoon. We examined the 3 empty caskets together. He couldn't explain it. His documentation clearly showed skeletal remains in caskets 12, 37, and 45 during excavation and preparation. Yet the caskets were empty. We reviewed the transport manifests. All 52 caskets had been logged and delivered. Nothing had been lost or misplaced during transit. The remains had disappeared from sealed caskets, leaving fresh scratch marks on the interior surfaces. Tuesday, I contacted the medical examiner's office to report the anomaly. They sent Dr. Patricia Chen to investigate. She examined all 52 caskets, reviewed the documentation, interviewed everyone involved. She had no explanation. Wednesday morning, I was preparing for the reburial ceremony scheduled for Friday when Elena called me to the preparation room. She'd been conducting final checks on all 52 caskets before transport to the cemetery. Caskets 12, 37, and 45 were no longer empty. Each contained a single piece of paper, modern notebook paper, written in ballpoint pen, the same message in all three caskets. We couldn't stay. The handwriting was identical in all three notes, dated November 7th, 2023, that morning. Dr. Chen returned to examine the notes. She documented everything, photographed the caskets, collected the papers for analysis. The writing was recent, the ink fresh, the paper contemporary. But the caskets had been sealed. The facility had been locked. Security footage showed no one entering the preparation room overnight. The notes had appeared inside sealed caskets, just like the scratch marks, just like the disappearance of the remains. Friday, we conducted the reburial ceremony at Forest Hills Cemetery. 49 graves containing the recovered victims. 3 empty caskets containing handwritten notes saying we couldn't stay. The cemetery director asked if I wanted to proceed with burying the empty caskets. I said yes. Whoever had been in those caskets deserved memorial space, even if they weren't physically present anymore. The ceremony was respectful and well attended. 52 graves in the memorial section. I stood by graves 12, 37, and 45 after everyone left. 3 empty caskets buried with fresh notes inside, scratched from within by hands that had been skeletal remains a week ago. Saturday morning, Forest Hills Cemetery's grounds supervisor called me. He'd conducted routine inspection of the new memorial section and noticed something unusual about graves 12, 37, and 45. The soil above all 3 caskets was disturbed, showing depression patterns as if something inside had shifted or settled. I visited the cemetery. The disturbances were obvious. Circular depressions directly above the 3 empty caskets, as if weight had suddenly appeared inside them after burial. Sunday, the groundskeeper reported the depressions had deepened. Monday showed further settlement. Tuesday morning, the cemetery director authorized limited excavation to investigate. We excavated grave 12 Wednesday afternoon. The casket was intact, properly positioned, sealed as we'd buried it. Inside, the note was still present. We couldn't stay. But now the note was accompanied by soil. Exactly 6 feet, 3 inches of soil, measured precisely, as if someone had taken a cross-section of a burial and placed it inside the casket. The soil showed layering consistent with the original mass grave site excavation. The casket wasn't empty anymore. It contained soil from where the remains had originally been buried, transported somehow from the excavation site to the sealed casket we'd buried at Forest Hills. We didn't excavate the other two graves. I knew what we'd find. The manifest had listed 52 victims. The excavation team recovered 52 sets of remains, but somewhere between excavation and reburial, 3 of them decided they couldn't stay. They left their caskets, scratched messages from the inside, and returned to their original burial location. The 3 empty caskets now contained soil from the mass grave where they'd been buried for 134 years. The notes are still there too. We couldn't stay. I've conducted 14 historical reburials since the factory fire project. I always count carefully now. I verify remains in every casket before sealing, check again before transport, confirm once more before burial. I photograph everything, document obsessively, because I learned that not everyone wants to be moved from where they died. Some of the dead choose where they want to rest, and when we try to move them, they find ways to tell us, through scratches on casket lids, through disappearing remains, through notes written in fresh ink inside sealed containers. We couldn't stay isn't a complaint. It's a statement of fact. 3 people who died in 1889, buried in a mass grave on factory property, who refused to be relocated to a memorial cemetery 134 years later. They're still there, wherever there is for the dead who choose to stay buried, still in that mass grave under the new apartment complex. Graves 12, 37, and 45 are marked at Forest Hills Cemetery, but they're empty except for soil and notes. They couldn't stay.